Good evening, everyone. Welcome to tonight's webinar, which is one in a series of exciting webinars which SANParks is hosting as part of the Kruger National Park's centenary commemoration. Sorry, we had a glitch or two there, so let me start again. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to tonight's webinar, which is one in a series of exciting webinars which SANParks is hosting as part of the Kruger National Park centenary commemoration. I am Kathy Griever, the General Manager for the Savannah Research Unit based in the Kruger National Park, and together with Samantha Mabuza and Sabelo Mabandwa, we'll be assisting with any questions or comments which you may want to post in the chat box during the webinar, and we will assist where possible. Tonight's webinar will explore how elephants and rhinos transform ecosystems and also look at why rhino poaching persists despite the immense effort being put into anti-poaching initiatives. So tonight's discussion will be led by Mr. Dani Pienaar, who was a co-host with me on the very first webinar, which we hosted in March. Dani is the Senior General Manager for Conservation and Area Integrity Management in Kruger National Park, a position he has held since 2020. He was previously the General Manager of Research in the Kruger National Park, and since 2008, he became the Senior General Manager of Scientific Services, overseeing research in all South African national parks. Dani was raised in the Kruger National Park and also started his career in the Kruger National Park in 1993. He has experience in managing research across the 22 national parks, science management, academic partnerships, protected area conservation, planning and management. He has also been involved in rare species research and management, also research and conservation policy drafting, and transboundary conservation. All this knowledge he gained over the past 38 years. He will be joined by Dr. Sam Ferreira, who is a SANParks specialist scientist in large mammals. He is a conservation ecologist specializing in management and conservation in African large mammals, particularly elephants and rhinos. He is also an extraordinary professor in the Faculty of Law at Northwest University and an adjunct professor at the Cape Peninsula University of Technology. So Dr. Ferreira serves as a scientific officer of the IUCN Species Survival Commission African Rhino Specialist Group, and he has authored more than 190 publications. So these two guys have an immense collective conservation knowledge between them, and I hope this will further enhance tonight's discussions by reflecting how science and real management experience facilitates tough decision-making, but also provides fresh perspectives shaping the future of elephants, rhinos, and also conservation itself. But before I hand over to Dani, I just want to draw your attention to the Kruger Recovery Fund that was established to help with the rehabilitation efforts in the park after the January 2026 flood event. So if you want to contribute, please use the bank details or the QR code showed on the screen. So with all that, I will now hand over to Dani.
Thank you very much, Kathy, and good evening, colleagues. So elephant and rhino management in the Kruger Park, that's certainly a topic that a lot of people are interested in. It's also a topic that we get lots of questions about. And people have strong and polarized opinions on this matter. So these opinions varies from my good friend Chris Bakkers, who's got a very strong emotional and philosophical connection with elephants, to a guy like Samuel Nkuna from Lilydale, whose elephants, where the elephants damage his crops at night and he loses a lot of money. Tonight we're going to try and explain to you how we manage these two species, what we've learned over the decades, and how we're approaching the issues and the philosophies behind it. So first let's start talking about the history of rhinos in the Kruger Park. By the time the Kruger Park was established in 1898, all the rhinos were effectively shot out of the park. So there were no rhino in the Kruger Park when it was established. In 1960, the first white rhino were introduced from Hluhluwe Mfolozi, and their numbers grew quite quickly. Black rhino were introduced in the 1970s, and the population didn't grow quite as quickly, probably because we did not introduce as many black rhino. We introduced about 90 black rhino compared to about 350 white rhino. But the numbers kept increasing, and I still remember in around 1986, white rhino numbers first went over the 1,000 mark in the Kruger Park. And we thought, yeah, that's a lot of rhino. But the numbers kept increasing, and it peaked at about 2010, when the numbers topped 10,000 for white rhino and more than 500 for black rhino. Unfortunately, at that time, the poaching crisis hit us as well. The price for rhino horn went through the roof, and the poachers responded. And since then, the rhino population in Kruger has been under severe threat. We had to respond on the ground with our Ranger Corps, sort of almost turned our Ranger Corps into a paramilitary unit, and really invested heavily in technology and equipment. Started intensive monitoring exercises and also relocations when we were still able to do that before disease issues stopped us from moving rhino out of the Kruger Park. But the rhinos sort of kept declining, and currently we sit with around 1,700 white rhino and around 300 black rhino in the Kruger Park. The Kruger Park is important for rhinos because it's one of the largest populations of black and white rhino in Africa, and we've got the potential to really hold vast numbers of these two species in the Kruger Park. So it's critical that we manage in a way that this population starts increasing again and starts reaching the capacity that we've seen before. Now the elephant story is a little bit different. In the Kruger Park, we've had people living here for thousands of years, right through the Stone and Iron Age eras. And they, of course, lived close to permanent water. And in those areas, they managed to keep elephant impact fairly low. What we saw is that the history tells us around here from 1860, European hunters started moving into the Kruger Park area, and they started hunting elephant at large scale. And that really depleted the numbers almost to zero. What we also found during that time is we had a rinderpest pandemic sweeping through the whole of Africa, and it crossed into this part of Africa in about 1896. The rinderpest pandemic wiped out most cloven hoof species and also most of the cattle that local communities and farmers had. So that by the time the Kruger Park was established, there were almost no herbivores left in this park. And the park was established, and slowly these numbers started building up again. Elephants started recolonizing from Mozambique, and herbivore numbers started building up. By about 1960, managers did the first aerial survey, and they were quite surprised to see almost 6,000 elephant in the Kruger Park. By that time, there was also concerns over loss of large trees, and park management decided to implement an elephant management policy that kept elephant numbers in the Kruger Park at about 7,500. It was done through a park-wide culling program. That program lasted for about 30 years until the mid-1990s, and about 14,000 elephant were culled during that period. Then elephant culling was stopped and the elephant population started increasing. Currently, we have the population is around 30,000 in the Kruger Park, but my colleague Sam will discuss this a bit more. Of course, we've seen an ongoing loss of large trees during that period, and that is not only due to elephants. There's other aspects like our fire policy that also plays a role in the loss and the recruitment of large trees. So the question that we often hear is, what should Kruger look like? So there's certain people that visited the Kruger Park in the 1970s and 80s as young kids, and they have a certain picture in their heads. I grew up here, I also had a similar picture in my head. Beautiful riparian gallery forest, and that was sort of our norms for what we think the Kruger Park should look like. However, what we realize is the Kruger Park is a dynamic system, and things have changed quite a lot over the decades. So what you can see here is a picture from around 1948 that shows the Skukuza area, and it certainly doesn't show a lot of riparian forest. The forest that I sort of grew up with is not here. Other pictures from Pretoria-Skop also shows quite an open landscape, and that changed over time to the very dense vegetation we see now in this picture here on the bottom right. Definitely have changed significantly. So certain areas in the Kruger Park got denser over the last 100 years. But we also see certain areas where vegetation and large tree vegetation has declined. That is mostly visible along some of our permanent rivers like the Lavubu River, also the Crocodile River in the south, and some of our other perennial rivers. And there's a picture from 1942 that shows there was quite a few more trees, and recently the area is a lot more open. And of course, in the Pretoria-Skop area, as I already mentioned, the area got a lot denser. So the key message is, over the past 80 years, woody cover decreased in certain areas and increased in others. And this shows that change is a complex issue, it's local, and it happens over time scales that the normal person can't quite understand, and that is difficult for managers to, and not difficult, it's impossible for managers to manage for a fixed state. This picture actually clearly shows what I'm trying to illustrate. It shows the Thulamela ruins in the foreground with some big baobabs in the background. Now, the Thulamela dynasty operated from about 800 years ago for a period of about 500 years, and those big baobabs would have established during that time. So the situation we had that led to the establishment of some of these riparian and forest and stands of large trees was a unique situation where you had a period of about 200 years where there were almost no elephant in what is now the Kruger Park. For a large part of that time, other herbivore numbers were very low, and people lived in this park. And through their disturbance actions, and also wood harvesting and burning, they kept the area open. And they allowed trees to establish along the rivers. That has changed now, and it is really unlikely that one will have that combination of events working together again that created this situation that some people see as the ideal situation in the Kruger Park. I'll now hand over to my colleague Sam just to take us a bit forward with more detail on how we deal with elephant and rhino populations. Thanks, Sam.
Thank you, Danny, and good evening, all the people that has joined us. Danny has given us a wonderful background of some of that historic context and actually how important people and elephants were. But maybe we must put ourselves in the context on where we are now, and certainly we can brag a little bit. When you look at this graph, the majority of Africa's elephants are sitting in southern Africa. And when you look at South Africa there now, we are sort of the fourth country with the most number of elephants. And of course, certainly for people that would like to see elephants around, that's an exciting thing. So I think there's something that we can brag about. But next slide, please, Kathy. The reality is that while some people appreciate and is worried about the persistence of elephants, particularly if you're from the global northwest of the world, there are other things that is really worrisome for us. The ecological impact that the elephants got, the conflict that they have with people, and of course, we realize that they also provide a lot of benefits for us. And then while we do those trade-offs, we need to be compassionate about it. The next slide. But the decisions are complex, and particularly in the South African context, it's sort of this dichotomy of things. One element is the moral complexity, and there are examples there about the sort of trade-offs that we struggle with, things like justice and equity. The justice for people versus the justice for elephants, for example, animal welfare versus biodiversity. Those are aspects that's on the one side. And then on the other side, we often have portrayals of factual uncertainty, aspects around whether there's scientific consensus, the interpretation of the precautionary principle, in that we will deal with this sort of thing in case something goes wrong. And of course, the impacts on tourism and livelihoods of people. So what we sort of do is just share with you some of the things that we had to sort of battle with in trying to make decisions. Next slide, please. So the very first part is, of course, a moral area, and this is really hinged on a lot of ethical framings. And typically in the world, you can probably find a good 8 or 9 different kind of ethical framings. And each one of them will have a key premise on how they think about things. But what is really troublesome for a decision maker or for deciding what you need to do is that you can use the same ethical theory or premise to argue for or against a particular unfavorable intervention, and that makes it very difficult. So what then happens is you end up with, as a manager, asking your question about whose ethics should matter most, and what would be, or even is it the person that has got making the biggest noise whose ethics are mattering most? So we needed to find something else. Next slide, please. And we get some guidance in how we evolved as humans. We are like any other species. We evolve through the survival of the fittest mechanisms, and we are essentially predators and competitors. None of us evolved any chlorophyll to make our own energy, so we have to use biodiversity. That is an unavoidable requirement. And that means that we should do that with respect, with thankfulness towards the resources, and shared universal values help us to deal with that, given that we are actually ecological relations with nature and not necessarily moral. And where some of that respect comes in is when we do something to a species, whether we manage it or let it do its own thing, every species has also evolved its own ability to deal with stresses, just like you and I deal with stresses when we lose a family member, for example. So that provides us with a different framing that helps us to at least have a more defendable way of how we can think about how we can make decisions. Next slide, please. So with that background now that we're trying to illustrate why some of the ethical framings are actually not so useful for us. Let's now think a little bit about the what elephants do now. Kruger National Park has got, like any national park, objectives. But when you look at the objectives, they are typically in three groupings. You want to really give people a nice tourism experience. We're managing, we have got neighbors that share the landscape with us. Our elephants can cause a lot of problems there. And then, of course, the ecological concerns. Next slide. So let me quickly run through. What we do is we actually ask very explicitly, how do elephants help us to help prevent us to achieve our objectives? So in this case, we ask, how do elephants help us to achieve tourism experience? And in simple terms, a tourist and an elephant has to be in the same place in the same time if a tourist wants to experience that. And that often depends on pretty much where elephants will be, depends on where the critical resources are, whether it is a waterhole like here or a typical river or woodlands or whatever the case might be. There are resources out there. The second thing for tourists is also what the elephants are doing. Especially if you are regularly visiting Kruger National Park, you have seen elephants lots of times in your lives, but you are probably seeing and enjoying many more of those interactions. So the people experience, the viewing experience is really linked to things like the viewing quality, things like what do you learn and interpreting when you see this, the emotional connections that we have, and it's sort of memorable encounters when you leave Kruger and you're back in Joburg or your busy schedule. You can think back about that wonderful experience when the little calf was playing in mud or something like that. So that's some of the realizations we've had, and how do we provide for those opportunities? Next slide, Kathy. The other human-elephant interaction is, of course, the one that's not necessarily good. Now, I'm going to want you to focus just on that map in the middle there a little bit. So you can see the shape of Kruger on the left-hand one. That's just above Swaziland. That patterns that you see there are actually elephants that were collared and have now been walking all over the place. On the left are cows, on the right-hand side are bulls. Now, these elephants don't read the script. They don't have passports, and they probably never did any COVID tests in the days of COVID tests. But what you're seeing is this elephants are moving across the landscape. Is exactly what we wanted to do when the guys are trying to deal with the transfrontier conservation areas. Now that's wonderful. This is what it does. But when elephants move around like that, they come in more and more in contact with people, and that outcome is not always good. In fact, it's probably most of the time not good. And part of it is because people have got different expectations. So when you look at the little graphic on the left-hand side, we tend to focus on the bottom end, how elephants cause damage to somebody's property, But when you actually say, what are the expectations that people have got? So, for example, farmers would like to see productive crops with no elephant damage. But rangers would like to see robust ecosystems, and we can go right across the spectrum of those stakeholders. So when we are dealing with human-elephant conflict, we got to think a bit about not just dealing with the damages as caused, but also the relationships that we got to have amongst each other when we've got different expectations. So a pragmatic response for us is identify the hotspots where elephants cause trouble, define why they're spending there. Is there a particular water source, or is it what time of the year are they there? Then we design it with the people that are actually affected. So it's just co-design and you do responses, but the principal thing is you are focusing on the reason why they're spending time there and causing that havoc in those conflict areas. Next slide. So here's an example of what we've experienced in the last 5 years in Kruger. On the left-hand side, left-hand graphic is the incidences or a map of the incidences of damages. So this is where elephants have actually left the park, like the picture showing there, broke a fence somewhere and they cause damage to somebody's crop or sometimes even threaten somebody's life. On the right-hand side are some of our responses, and this is where we actually did active incidences of control and the damage-causing animal act, and where we actually had to euthanize elephants to deal with those particular situations. And there's a set of decisions we make when we make the decisions whether an elephant should be culled or not. Next slide. But the reality is there's a diverse set of interventions that has to happen. Yes, there's the understanding why are elephants spending particular time there. Then we're engaging with people. What can we do together as we are trying to work out these particular problems. We try to do proactive deterrence. Some of those pictures you see there are, for example, little exercises on using some chili flavored bags and see that on hotspot or particular spots of the fences that elephants may go. And one of our things, a reactive responses is moving with a helicopter. So that bottom graph right hand side, you just see the actual number of incidences of where we actually had to deploy a helicopter. And that's quite a lot if you think a little bit on the number that you see there. But the reality is there is a range of interventions as indicated with that text in the middle there. DCA control of elephants, of course, deploying the aircraft, chasing them, community engagement, and when it comes to lions, we do livestock compensation. We don't have currently any elephant compensation. Things like participating in workshops and actually going to that field place and see where things has happened and get an idea of what's happening there, and then even activities like testing some of the deterrents and so forth. So this is a evolving process because context change fast, very quickly, as we have realized managing a system like Kruger. Next slide. But when we get to the third element in how elephants influence us, of course, the first question people ask, how many elephants are there? And when you tell them that we have roughly about 30,000 elephants currently in the park, then they ask you, well, are there not too many elephants and aren't there any ecological problems? There must be a big problem. Next slide, please. And it is very good that there's a concern because people are concerned about what the biodiversity trends are. But what we often see is that there are some misconceptions about what reality is. So here's an example of a bundle of perceptions that has been on social media and things like that on how elephants or things have changed in a period when elephant abundance has increased. There's not necessarily very clear links made in those things. But when you look on the right-hand side on the example of some of the actual counts on some of those animals, even if you look at the giraffe as a comparison to the one on the left, the giraffe is down in the bottom and in the middle. Since we stopped culling an intensive management of Kruger, so that was stop culling animals, reduced water distribution, drop fences, our fire regimes also changed. Prior to that, we had many species declining. You look at kudu and warthog, for example. And when we switched off that intensive one, we started actually see some of these increases happening. All I'm saying is that there are patterns here that doesn't link with what are often portrayed in some of the perceptions that may be out in the landscape. The question is, next slide, please. The reality is that there are some very key lessons that we've learned that link to some of our assumed ecological framings. And probably the most important one is that you do not find necessarily a very clear link between the changes that you might see, or in this case, ecological or effect sizes of elephants. So if you have an effect size of -5, it means I've actually had a change 5 times. So for example, I may have had a 5 times reduction in tree density, for example. And what is concerning for us, yes, when there are a lot of elephants, there are also a lot of negative impacts, but I also have a lot of negative impacts in the big ones when there's a few number of elephants, if you look on the left-hand side. So one of the difficulties is that if you're managing for a particular density, let's say 1 elephant per square meter, or whatever it is, or square kilometer, you may have a false sense of security because you may actually have some consequences even at much lower densities of that happening. So what the critical insight is that it depends much on where elephants spend time, what they do when they're in the particular place, how long they spend at those particular places. And one of the things that we have realized also, and that's what that map in the middle tells you, those little polygons that you see are actually home ranges of elephants, whereas on the edges of Kruger were lighter markings. Those were edges where we didn't want to have as much impact. The problem is that elephants didn't read the plan, and the reality is that where elephants have got impacts is at a much smaller scale, a much localized scale than just generally everywhere, wherever they're walking. So I think those are two really important ones, is that there's very many elephant impacts in Kruger, but you need to manage that at the locality where it is happening, rather than just a broad scale brush and say, look, if I reduce total number of elephants in an area, I'm gonna not have that problem. So I think that's a big insight. Can we reduce the intensity with which elephants use those particular ecological areas where they are busy causing ecological impact? Next slide. So when our switchers then had to think a bit about, well, why would they spend particular times in certain places? And that links to the particular resources that they need. The water is a major one. Elephants basically need to drink every day. The particular food they like. Elephants like certain trees more than others, just like kids in a grocery shop likes the ice cream aisle more than the cabbage aisle. Elephants also like comfort. So in the hot dry season, the cows make choices so that the little calves don't warm up as much as what it would be if they were just running around in the sun. And then elephants look for safety, and that relates to some of the things that Dania showed us in the beginning. So we often inherited systems on the right-hand side where habitat has changed. We have put a fence over small areas, and in small parks, those fences can be very effective in keeping elephants in. And we have got water that forces elephants to spend time all the time in the same place in the seasons. Next slide. So one of the things that is really important linking to this human-elephant interaction in historic times is that map that you see on the left-hand side is what we've identified of where elephant impact areas are, and on the right-hand side is where people used to live. And knowing that elephants don't like people, elephants avoided where peoples were. Now, with no people there anymore, they're spending lots more time in those places, and it's then when they're changing environment. So we've got to think a bit about how do we manage it. There's some good ecological theories around landscapes of fear, but when you do that, when elephants feel fear in a landscape, they've got to have other parts in the landscape also where they feel safe. So you've got to create these gradients of safety and danger and all these sort of things. And in that case, you focus then on the areas where you are. So the real important thing is we don't control numbers over the park, but you're actually going to control elephants at that locality where they're causing problems. And sometimes that requires you to reduce numbers there. Next slide. Okay, so when we look at Kruger now, the Kruger Elephant Management Plan has got 4 objectives that was recently approved. I'm not going to go into detail. You can see one focus on stakeholder relationships, the second one focus on elephant populations, but actually the criminality elements. Then we're thinking about how we manage those ecosystem risks. And lastly, everything that we do with elephants create opportunities for us that we can deal with. Next slide. Right. So in short, when you think about what we've learned about elephants, our realization when we're working on a very large scale, you've seen that elephants in Kruger are now wandering all over the place into Mozambique. It's actually part of a very big population across the entire GLTFCA. We've got to think a little bit differently. That we've got to focus on the resources and the activity that they do and where they're doing it. And that's history of people in in disturbing elephants in the landscape was a very big part, as Danny has shown you in the beginning, in shaping how this place looked like. And our relationship is very much ecological with elephants. We want to manage the way that elephants cause problem at conflict or at impact areas. And a key part of that is actually we can't do these sort of things in this broad landscape if we do not have actually some sort of safety and security in the space. So if we are dominated by criminality, it's actually very difficult for us to do things. So what can rhinos teach us about that? The next slide, please. So yes, Dani has given you a little bit of background on the rhino history, but perhaps we also need to put the context of where we fit in the world. Next slide, please. So when you look at the global trends in African rhinos, this is what the Rhino Specialist Group reported to CITES at the end of 2024, and there were just under 7,000 black rhinos in the world, and just under 16,000 white rhinos in the world. There were a bundle of rhinos that are also in zoos, but you can see that there was a massive crash up till the mid-1990s, and then rhinos started recovery, and then from about 2010, things started going down again. So there's a lot of fluctuation that happened with rhinos across, and most of that fluctuations link to criminalities that link to poaching of rhinos. Next slide. So when you talk about rhinos anyway, you very typically will get sort of key concerns, and there's probably 5 sort of things that are standing out. One is poaching, one is rhino horn trade, one is the sort of management interventions that you can do. Obviously, when you do these sort of things, you got to have money. And then, of course, rhinos have got impacts on people's lives in many, many different ways. Next slide, please. Now, just to put you in context on that first element, and we will focus a bit on the poaching. So this is the global pattern of rhino poaching over since the 2006 period. The dark little dot on the top are the Asian rhinos, and as you can see, this is largely African rhinos, and sadly, a very large fraction of that pattern of African rhinos, probably close to 80% of that, are actually coming from Kruger. And we often ask, why the hell do people poach? And there are some work that has suggested that there are very overriding things, like, for example, long histories of trade, inelastic demand, high profit potential. This relates to distant markets, somewhere in Asia. But then there are also other things like inadequate enforcement. We hear that often people complain about it, but then unclear property rights, and sometimes wildlife conflict disincentives, not so much with rhinos, but with elephants, it might be the case. The property rights is really difficult for us. Currently, if a rhino walks from Kruger into Sabi Sands, the ownership might actually switch to Sabi Sands one, but when that same rhino walks into a local communities, we actually go and chase the rhino back. So these are some of the uncertainties. Next slide, please. But one of the things that we have realized is that big parks are good for ecological reasons, but when crime starts dominating the landscape, it becomes really tough to get that. So in this case, when you just look at the black rhinos there, those little parks on the left, those were our other national parks. If you have a dot above that, horizontal flat line, it means your population is growing, and if it's below that, it means your population is declining. So pre-poaching, the big parks, which was Kruger, was like those smaller parks, also growing. The various you see in those smaller parks, because that's when we were starting with a lot of small populations. But increasingly, when poaching started, those small parks actually still did well. But the big park really struggled. The population growth in Kruger has just gone very negative. And that is because when you are big and crime is starting to dominate, it's really hard to get access control, situational awareness, maintain integrity of staff, all cost effectively, and importantly, know your rhinos at the individual level. It's really hard to create names for 10,000 rhinos in Kruger, for example. Next slide. Now, the outcome was, because of that across the continent, we now see rhinos living in very, primarily, doesn't matter which subspecies it is, they're living in small areas, and they're typically much smaller than about what what even an average reserve size is nowadays. And the second thing is they live in small populations. If you've got a rhino population that are 30 or 50 animals big, you are excited. That's a relatively large population. So we've got these fragmented things that has happened, which are really troublesome in terms of how we manage those sort of things. And that's large from a biological point of view, but that's largely because that's what you have to do if you want to protect rhinos if crime is busy dominating the landscape. Next slide, please. So in a changing world, this is what has happened. We see that there are some captive rhinos that has lost their natural role. Sometimes we try to rewild them to back to natural places. So, for example, that's what's happening with things like the ex-John Hume ones. We're facing climate change. We have got some genetic debates around certain what species were where, and habitats are fragmented, as we said, but not just fragmented. They're also most of the time unsafe. Next slide, please. So in that context, when you look at what happened in Kruger, and this is a very sad graph. So on the left-hand side are the black rhinos. We introduced them in the 1970s, as Dania said, and we had this wonderful growth until there in the, just before 2010, and then things started taking our population down. The white rhinos is even more worrisome. We are more or less down to where we were about 25 years ago, and I think that's an important reality that we have to realize and think. And that's part of the reason is this problem that big, large areas impose on you when crime starts winning in the landscape. Next slide, please. So in this context, SANParks played a big role way back and I think in 2014, to guide and think about how South Africa can approach it. So it had 4 pillars: compulsory anti-poaching, right, the intervention, increasing rhino numbers, the typical biological management. There were long-term sustainability interventions, thinking a bit about how you can even create sustainable demand for some of the products. And then there were game-changing interventions. So disruption of organized crime and empowering local people were actually 2 really important ones. And I'm going to hopefully share with you something very shortly about illustrating that point. Next slide. So in that context, Kruger's conservation plan falls within SANParks Rhino conservation strategy. This is being reviewed this year, especially because the National Biodiversity Management Plan. And there's a range of things that we do around here, right from layered security, strategic dehorning, managing incursions in some buffer areas, our integrity management. There's a specific seminar happening, I think, in a couple of weeks' time, specifically on the rhino things that Kathy Dreyer will like. But as you can see, this responses require quite a diversity of responses and also diversity of divisions in the park that has to participate in doing that. Next slide, please. One of the things that we did do is actually ask about what some of the things are really effective for us. So there was a very big study that was published in a highly related journal. And, you know, what turned out is that the dehorning at the time made a really big difference in poaching rates. And that is because you are busy doing something directly to a rhino. It doesn't mean the other elements of that you are doing is not working. In fact, you will not be able to get that dehorning effect if you don't have the other interventions supporting it. So that is the important insight. The second insight is, although dehorning is doing this for us, next slide, please, we have some challenges. When you look at this graph here, this is the number of rhinos poached in Kruger over the years. But we had this wonderful decline, and up to the end of 23, 24, we had the lowest. And then all of a sudden, that's a period when we were doing a lot of dehorning. We were getting that effect that you just saw on the previous slide. Now we have got a whole new onslaught. And some of the things that we think is happening is, you know, when you think about it, the whole of South Africa is busy dehorning. In Kruger, there are also very few rhinos. There's messages that says Kruger is not dehorning as intensely. There has been political uncertainty and certainly the funding withdrawal with some of the USA things. And in the criminal's mind, you know, he's now thinking, let me go to the places where it was easy before, if rhinos and ladue aren't everywhere. He may want to make up the weight. It's better to kill 2 to 3 rhinos for the effort I put in there to make it up. When they say that you're not intense in deer hunting anymore, the guys think about it as an opportunity. And then, of course, if they think there's no rule of law and there's no more rangers in some of these areas because of funding, then things will change. Next slide. So if I go back to the insight that size is really problematic, there was a little study in 2021 that highlighted that the poaching rate of Kruger at that time was the highest in any of these things, in provincial reserves and in private properties. Private properties were doing very well. The other national parks, the 3 others, actually had the lowest one. So size mattered. And that's for those 4 reasons. We think it's because you've got realistic access control, you've got advanced situational awareness, you can cost efficiently manage your styles, pride and integrity, and you can regularly monitor individual rhinos. Next slide. Now, just to come back quickly to why it's so important about dealing with organized crime and trying to address the social injustice and people's opportunities. We ran a little model sometimes a year ago, and that what you see in the top, the red is what actually Kruger was at that time, and the green is any other rhinos in South Africa. And there were different things that we tried. So you can protect more. You can go and reduce demand somewhere far away from you. I can provide supply, or I can do all 3 of those things. And when we did not complement any of this with disrupting organized crime and providing alternative opportunities for people at a local scale, we could never get sustainability. So it actually became really important that you got to think about, how do I create this regional safety and security beyond just the boundary of Kruger National Park? And when you get that right, you unlock a whole bunch of additional economic opportunities for you. But that's an important insight that we need to do. Next slide. So I've given you a quick rundown of rhinos and elephants, but I'm going to pass back to Dani now, because I think the reflection that you've seen so far highlights complexity and systems, but maybe we also need to start changing thinking how we do things. Dani, back to you.
Thank you very much, Sam. Colleagues, so Sam has explained and showed to you, we are currently struggling with managing and protecting the rhino population in the Kruger Park. And that means we have to look at things a little bit differently. So one of the theories that we started looking at is the infinite game by Simon Sinek. He came up with it. So he says there's 2 types of games. There's finite games where the players are known, there's fixed rules, and the game ends at a certain point, and there's a winner and a loser. And any soccer or rugby game is like that. Then there's the infinite game. There are known and unknown players. There's no agreed upon rules. The game never ends. And the purpose of the infinite game is to actually just stay in the game for as long as you can, or forever. Now, how does that impact on how we think about rhino poaching? Battling with the slides here. Okay, there we go. So, in the finite game, the goal is to solve the crime. In the infinite game, it changes. So then the goal becomes to protect rhinos for the future. So what we're saying is that, yes, we should continue to do all the anti-poaching and protection work that we have been doing, the dehorning and the finding and the catching and the conviction of poachers. But we should also start looking and combining that with looking at the rhino population itself, how to maximize the growth, and that means, of course, monitoring of the rhino population, but also how do we enable our rangers to stay in the game for the long run. That means we have to make them more resilient, because currently we're sitting with a situation of burnout in some of our guys, because you cannot just sit in this situation for the whole time where you're fighting rhino poaching day in and day out. That means we got to focus on their well-being, and trust is critical. And for us to do that, integrity testing becomes very important also. So in August, the head ranger, Kathy Dreyer, is going to give a talk about how ranger services changed in the Kruger Park over the decades, and she will discuss a bit more about how we are strengthening and capacitating and making our ranger corps more resilient to stay in this game for the long run. The other theory that we're looking at now is called the prisoner's dilemma. And this is an interesting game where you can choose to cooperate or to double cross or defect against the person that you're playing with. So in a once-off game, it makes sense to try and exploit your partner, because that would give you more benefits than if you both cooperate. However, if you both try and double cross your partner, then you're both gonna lose. There was a guy by the name of Professor Axelrod who looked at a number of different models and strategies how to play the prisoner's dilemma, especially when it's a continuous game and not a once-off game. In other words, you staying with your neighbors and your neighboring communities in the long run. And how do you play that game then? He found that a tit-for-tat strategy works best, and they refined it a bit where they called it a generous tit-for-tat strategy. Now, what does that mean? That means you react to what your partner or your colleague or your neighbor does. So if they cooperate, you cooperate. If they defect or try and double cross you start becoming not so nice to them. But when they start cooperating again, you do the same. And that has the best outcomes in the long run for both parties. Now, if you apply that to how we should manage and think about rhino in this system, it suggests that you should start off by being nice to your neighbors and your partners and your colleagues. And you start cooperating first, you build trust and you build relationships. However, you should always be firm. And when there are criminal activity, you should really respond firmly to that and be clear about the consequences. However, if your opponent or neighbors changes their behavior and they become start cooperating again, then of course you forgive them quickly and you continue both moving forward. That means that you have to be clear, consistent and transparent and communicate clearly and continuously with all the players in this game so that people understand where they are. To put this into the context a bit of rhino conservation, in a law enforcement situation, to cooperate, you would need to share intelligence, coordinate patrols, share risks and share lessons. And that would give criminals fewer safe areas. In the rhino conservation situation, you might cooperate by sharing rhinos, you could coordinate populations, meta-populations, again share genetics and lessons. And with your neighboring communities, again, you start by providing benefits to them. If they reciprocate, you continue and you continue building trust in the long run. And just to summarize that, you start by cooperating first. You defend yourself where necessary, you forgive where possible, and you're absolutely clear on what you're trying to do and to achieve. To summarize that, rhino conservation is often approached as a finite contest between conservation authorities and poachers. Such approaches focus on arrests, patrols, and enforcement outcomes. And while these remain essential components of conservation, they are insufficient on their own because poaching networks continue to adapt faster than management can. New actors emerge and conservation resources always remain limited. What we're proposing is that rhino conservation should be viewed as an infinite game in which the objective is not to win temporary battles against poaching, but to maintain a thriving rhino populations and a resilient conservation system over generations. This then seeks to transform rhino protection from the responsibility of a limited number of rangers into a shared social endeavor that involves, of course, rangers and park management, but also communities, visitors, our neighboring private reserve, the government, and also our transfrontier conservation partners. So colleagues, I guess we've sort of given you some insight about why setting objectives in complex systems where elephant and rhino live are really not easy. What we said is that we should shift from what should the system look like to more what processes do we need to sustain the system. And we manage more for function feedback and flexibility. And this graph just shows some of the traditional thinking, and it's not to say that it's not important anymore, but what we're trying to add is the column on the right, where the vision is thriving biodiversity and human well-being. We're looking at processes that support biodiversity and benefits, and yes, populations are important, but also the dynamics between the different populations and the system are just as critical, because that is what makes the system resilient in the long run. Thank you very much, Sam, Kathy, and the other people that made this webinar possible. I think we just about run out of time, but I'll hand over to Kathy now to close this. Just also, if there are questions or additional webinars that you guys want or issues we want to touch on, we can certainly consider those going forward. Put them in the chat box, because these webinar series will run for the whole year. Thank you very much, colleagues.
Thank you to Sam and Dani for a very informative presentation. And I really hope that our audience tonight found the discussion as valuable as I did. Thank you for your time, as I'm sure we are all getting ready to watch the opening ceremony of the FIFA World Cup a little later. So for those who may have joined us late, I would like to draw your attention to the Kruger Recovery Fund that was established to help with the rehabilitation efforts in the park after the January 2026 flood event. I would also like to highlight, as Dani mentioned, we will be having a series of conservation-related webinars throughout the year. But if you do feel like you need alternative discussion topics, please do put it in the chat box, or also use the email address which we are highlighting on the slide. Yeah. The other thing is we've also had requests for recordings of all our previous webinars. So please go to our Sandparks YouTube page where you can access all the recordings linked to the Kruger National Park Centenary. But our comms teams will also be sharing a link in the chat box, which you guys can use to get to these recordings. But once again, thank you so much for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your evening. Goodbye.